The great hall of the Workland was built of black stone carved into jagged peaks that seemed to rise straight into the skies. Torches burned with green fire along the walls, filling the chamber with a harsh glow. On the floor of the arena, the sand was stained with the blood of a dozen battles. Battles where only one truth mattered. To lose was to die. Lyra stood there with her chest heaving. Her armor cracked, her weapon bent from the clash that had just ended. She had trained since. She was a child to never falter, never show weakness, never bend. Yet the truth was there before the council. She had been defeated. And worse than that, she had been defeated not by one of her own kind, but by a human prisoner. A man her people considered a lesser creature. Daniel stood across from her, breathing hard, his face bruised and his wrists still bound by the metal. Cuffs they had forced on him before the fight. He had fought with nothing but raw instinct and the will to survive. He had no honor code like hers, no sacred rituals to guide his hands. He fought the way the dying fight when the last hope is about to be torn away. And somehow he had won. The silence in the hall was heavy. Thousands of eyes looked down from the high seats where the warriors sat in judgment. The council of elders, cloaked in black and crimson, rose from their stone chairs. One of them raised a clawed hand, his voice cutting through the silence. By the code of the clan, the defeated must pay with blood. The law is clear. Failure has only one end. A murmur rolled through the crowd. It was not pity, it was expectation. No one doubted the sentence. For Lyra, death was not just punishment, it was the natural order. To lose was to admit weakness. To admit weakness was to admit unworthiness to live. That was the truth hammered into every child of her kind before they could even lift a blade. Lyra lowered her eyes. She felt no tears. Her kind did not cry. But deep inside her chest, a storm was breaking. She had failed, and though she had believed herself ready to die if that day came, a part of her now trembled at the thought. Was it fear of death, or shame? That she had lost to a human? Daniel's voice broke the silence. It was rough, strained from the fight, but it carried across the chamber with surprising strength. No, she does not deserve this. The crowd erupted in outrage. Shouts echoed from the seats. The elders leaned forward with disbelief. No one spoke in the hall of judgment unless spoken to, and no one, least of all a prisoner of another race, dared to challenge the code. The elder at the center of the council hissed, "Human, you are not given voice here. Your victory means nothing. You will be returned to your chains and she will be executed." But Daniel stepped forward, still bound, still breathing hard as though each breath was fire, and yet his words did not falter. She fought with honor. She fought until she had nothing left. You call it weakness. I call it strength. You call it failure. I call it courage. If anyone must die today, then take me. Not her. The torches seemed to flicker. The noise of the crowd faltered into uneasy murmurs. Lyra's eyes widened. She had never heard such words. To defend another's honor at the cost of one's own life was not a thought her people could even imagine. Her world was built on the belief that only the strong survived. Yet here stood the human who had defeated her, choosing death over her, refusing to let her pay for her failure. The council erupted in fury. You insult our law. You twist our code with human lies. Strength is truth. Weakness is death. That is how we have endured. Daniel raised his head, blood dripping from a cut on his brow. Strength is not killing the one who falls. Strength is helping them rise again. You endure because you are afraid to change. My kind endures because we refuse to give up. Even when beaten, we rise again. That is why she should live. The crowd was split now. Some shouted for silence, for the human to be cut down where he stood. Others, younger voices, cried out in curiosity, in doubt. The code was absolute. yet the words of this broken, battered human stirred something in them. Lyra felt her chest tighten. Her hands shook against the weight of her broken blade. She could not understand him. Why would he choose death for her, an enemy, a stranger? She had been raised to believe humans were weak and cowardly, yet this man stood, defiant against her entire people, with nothing but his voice and his belief. The elder's hand slammed against the stone table. Enough. If this human wishes to take her place, then so be it. But mercy is not in our code. He will face the trial of the labyrinth. If he survives, then the girl may live. If he dies, both their deaths will be sealed as fools who dared to question law. The crowd roared with approval and bloodlust. The sentence was given. Daniel bowed his head slightly, as though accepting the burden without hesitation. Lyra's throat felt dry. She wanted to speak, to shout that this was madness, that she did not need his sacrifice, but the words would not come. For the first time in her life, her strength felt like nothing compared to the strange force she saw in his eyes. The guards moved quickly, dragging Daniel toward the gate that led to the labyrinth, carved beneath the mountain. The doors groaned open, and the darkness beyond seemed to swallow the light of the torches. The crowd began to chant, hungry for blood and spectacle. Lyra watched helplessly. Her fate was no longer her own. A human had stolen it from the jaws of death, and now he walked into a trial where even the strongest of her kind rarely returned. She felt the weight of her people's eyes on her, calling her a failure, a shame, a warrior not worth saving. Yet all she could think of was his voice, echoing against the stone walls. Strength is not killing the one who falls. Strength is helping them rise again. For the first time in her life, she wondered if perhaps everything she had been taught was a lie. The iron doors of the labyrinth closed behind Daniel with a sound that echoed like thunder through the chamber, and the torches flickered as though the air itself had been shaken by the weight of what had just been decided. The people roared from the seats above, some cheering with bloodlust, others whispering with unease. But for Lyra, every sound faded into a heavy silence that pressed against her chest. She could not take her eyes off the place where the human had disappeared. She had been ready for death, ready to bow her head to the blade, and yet he had stolen that fate from her and carried it into the darkness himself. The elders sat high above, cloaked in shadows, their eyes fixed on her as though they were waiting for her to break. She had shamed her people by losing, and now she was shamed again by standing while another fought to defend her right to exist. Her training screamed inside her head that she should accept his sacrifice without thought, that his death was the balance owed for her weakness. But another voice, strange and unwelcome, kept whispering that this was not right. She had fought him, she had seen his strength, and she knew he had not spoken out of cowardice or trickery. He had spoken because he believed in something her people had long forgotten. From the high seats, the crowd hushed as a deep rumble rose. Beneath the arena, the labyrinth had awakened. Stone doors opened along the sand, and images of what lay below appeared across the glass screens hung above the chamber. The people leaned forward in hunger to see how the human would fare in the trial that had claimed even the strongest of their kind. Daniel moved cautiously through the first corridor. The walls pressed close on either side, jagged with sharp stone, and the floor was wet with dark liquid that glistened under the faint glow of the fire pits. His chains had been loosened just enough for him to move his arms, but his body bore the marks of the duel with Lyra, and every step was pain. Yet he walked forward without hesitation, his eyes sharp, his breathing steady. Lyra clenched her fists. She wanted to turn away, to shield herself from what she knew would come, but she could not look anywhere else. The human had spoken words that had unsettled even the elders, and she needed to see if those words were hollow, or if there was truly some strength in him that her people had never understood. The first beast struck from the shadows, a massive creature of scales and fangs that leapt toward Daniel with a roar. The crowd cried out in excitement, but the human did not falter. He rolled aside, the claws tearing stone instead of flesh, and with nothing but the length of chain around his wrist, he lashed the creature's eye. It screamed, thrashing against the walls, and Daniel drove the broken end of his shackle deep into its throat until it fell silent on the ground. The arena shook with the noise of the crowd, but Lyra felt her heart pounding for reasons she did not understand. He had no weapon, no armor, no training in her people's ways, yet he had survived the first trial with nothing but will and speed. He had faced death and met it head-on. The labyrinth was not finished. The screens showed Daniel pressed onward, into chambers filled with traps, with spears that struck from the walls, with pits hidden beneath loose stone. Twice he fell, his body slamming against the floor, but each time he rose again, blood streaking his skin, yet his eyes still burning with the same fire. Around her the younger warriors whispered among themselves. They had never seen such defiance. In the face of certain death, their code taught them to strike quickly, to end weakness, to silence failure. But this human refused to surrender to what should have been inevitable. Lyra's chest ached. She remembered her own training, the way her mentors had beaten her down again and again until she could rise without hesitation. Yet she had been taught that rising once you were defeated was shameful, that to fall was to lose all honor. Watching Daniel, she realized he rose not out of duty, but because he would not let death take him until he had given everything. The labyrinth's final gate loomed on the screens. It was a hall filled with fire and shifting stone blocks that crushed everything in their path. The crowd leaned forward, some eager to see the human burned alive, others holding their breath in wonder. Daniel staggered, his body trembling, blood dripping from countless wounds. He dragged one leg across the floor, and still he moved forward. Lyra could not stop herself. She stood, her voice rising across the chamber, before she even realized what she was doing. Enough. He has proven his strength. No more. The council turned their eyes to her. The elder at the center sneered, his voice sharp as a blade. You dare speak after your failure. Sit down and remember your shame. His life is the price. If he dies, the code remains pure. If he survives, then you may live. Do not dishonor yourself further. But Lyra's voice shook the chamber again. He has already done what none of us would have. He has faced the trial with nothing but his will, and he still walks. If this is weakness, then what is strength? The crowd erupted into noise again. Half cried out that she spoke treason, half shouted that the human had shown them something new. The elders glared, their authority trembling for the first time in generations. On the screens, Daniel reached the last block, his body pressed low as fire raged around him. His arms slipped and he fell to the ground, his body lying still at the gate. The people gasped, the chamber falling into silence. Lyra's heart stopped. She did not think. She did not weigh honor or shame. She only knew that if he died there, if the fire consumed him, something precious would be lost forever. With a cry that echoed through the chamber, she broke from her place and rushed toward the gates of the labyrinth, ignoring the shouts of the guards, ignoring the hands that reached to stop her. Her people would call her traitor. They would call her weak, but in that moment, none of it mattered. She could not stand by while the only being who had ever stood for her lay broken on the ground. The iron gates groaned as Lyra forced her way past the guards, her voice drowned beneath the roar of the crowd. They shouted in anger and confusion as she broke the sacred rule of the arena. No one entered the labyrinth once the trial had begun, not even the elders themselves, but she no longer cared for their laws. Her only thought was of the human who had collapsed at the final gate, his body bloodied, his strength nearly gone, yet still refusing to yield until his last breath. The heat of the labyrinth struck her face as she stepped inside. The air shimmered with fire and smoke. She could hear the grinding of the stone blocks that crushed everything in their path. Somewhere within the haze she saw him, Daniel, lying on the ground, his chest rising and falling faintly. His arms trembled as he tried once more to push himself upward, but his strength betrayed him, and he slumped back against the scorched floor. Lyra's people shouted from beyond the gates. The elders commanded her to return, their voices sharp with fury. They declared her a traitor. They declared that she would share the fate of the human if she disobeyed, but their words reached her like distant whispers. The only sound that mattered was the labored breath of the man who had refused to let her die. She ran forward, her armor scraping against the stone, her hands reaching for him. Daniel's eyes flickered open. They were clouded with pain, yet still steady, still defiant. His voice was rough, broken, but he managed to speak. "Go back. This is my fight. You must live." But Lyra shook her head fiercely. "No, you gave me your fight when you stood for me. I will not leave you here." She pulled him against her shoulder, and the weight of his body nearly crushed her. She was wounded from their duel earlier, her strength not at its peak, but she carried him all the same. The fire from the walls licked at her skin and the stone. Blocks began to grind again, shifting to close the passage ahead. She pushed forward, dragging him step by step, the ground shaking beneath her feet. The crowd gasped from the chamber above as the sight filled the screens. They saw their warrior, once condemned, now bearing the human toward the exit. Some spat curses, calling her weak beyond forgiveness. Others shouted in awe, for they had never seen such defiance of the code. Daniel coughed, his voice weak, yet he still tried to resist. "You will be marked for this. They will kill you too." Lyra's grip only tightened as she pulled him clear of a falling stone that crashed inches behind them. "Then let them try. You saved me once. I will not let you die alone." Step by step they crossed the chamber, fire roaring around them, stones shifting above their heads. Her body screamed in pain, her legs trembled, but she pressed on. For the first time in her life, she was not fighting for honor, not fighting for glory, not even fighting for survival. She was fighting for someone else. The thought gave her strength she did not know she carried. When they reached the final gate, the iron doors that had seemed so far now loomed before them, closed tight by the will of the elders. The crowd's roar turned to chaos as the people argued among themselves, some demanding the doors be sealed forever, others calling for them to be opened. The elders stood unmoved, their faces carved in stone, determined that the trial must end in death. Daniel lifted his head weakly. "It is over. They will never open it. You must let me go." But Lyra pressed him against the gate, her voice like fire. "You told them strength is helping another rise. If that is true, then we rise together or not at all." She struck the iron with her fist, once, twice, the sound echoing through the chamber above. The people shouted louder, their voices splitting in two currents, one of anger, one of rising unrest. The younger warriors in the seats looked to one another, doubt burning in their eyes. Never before had anyone challenged the sacred law so openly. Never before had anyone spoken against the code without being silenced by fear. The elders raised their hands to order the guards, but before they could act, the crowd began to push back. Voices rose from every corner, some crying for blood, others crying for mercy. And in the clash of voices a dangerous thing was born: hesitation. The guards faltered. The people did not move as one. The law, unbroken for centuries, trembled. Daniel's body sagged against her shoulder. His breath was shallow, his face pale from loss of blood. Yet when his eyes met hers, there was a faint smile, tired but real. "You are not what they say. You are stronger than any of them." Her throat tightened. She had never heard words like that, not from her own kind, not from anyone. Strength had always been measured in victories, in kills, in never bending to defeat. Yet here he was, broken and bleeding, telling her that strength was what she was showing now. She felt her chest burn with something unfamiliar, a fire that came not from anger or duty, but from choice. The gate creaked. The voices of the people grew louder, demanding the elders give answer. At last one of the elders stood, his cloak whipping behind him as he shouted across the hall. "They are both traitors. Open the gate and bring them forth. Their deaths will cleanse this stain." The Fintu. Iron doors groaned wide, and the light of the chamber flooded into the labyrinth. Lyra stepped forward, still holding Daniel upright, her body trembling from exhaustion, but her eyes fierce. She knew what awaited them outside. She knew the guards would surround them, blades ready to cut them down. Yet she walked with her head high. If she must die, she would die standing beside the one who had shown her another way. As they emerged, the crowd erupted again, half in cheers, half in rage. The elders motioned to the guards, spears lowered in every direction. Daniel tried to speak, his voice barely more than a whisper. "They will kill us." Lyra shifted her grip, her broken blade still in her other hand. Her voice was calm, though her heart thundered. "Then we will fight together." And in that moment, for the first time, she felt no shame for losing, no fear of failing. She felt only the weight of choice, the choice to stand not for law or code, but for something greater. The gate of the labyrinth closed behind them with a thundering weight that echoed through the chamber, and the crowd fell into a storm of voices. Some cheered for blood, others shouted in disbelief, and others still seemed uncertain, torn between the old law and the strange new fire that had been sparked by what they had just seen. Lyra held Daniel upright, her body shaking from exhaustion. Her armor scorched and cracked, yet her grip was strong. His head leaned against her shoulder, his breath shallow, his body weakened to the point of collapse, but his eyes still burned with defiance. The guards stepped forward in a ring, their spears gleaming under the light of the torches. The elders raised their hands to silence the crowd, their faces dark with fury. Their voices rang through the chamber, declaring that both the human and the warrior who had betrayed her place must die. The words cut through the air like blades, leaving no doubt of their intent. Lyra's heart thundered. Her people had never questioned such orders, not once in living memory. To stand against the council was to choose death, yet she felt no fear now. She felt only a clarity that burned stronger than any law. She shifted Daniel gently against the stone pillar near her, placing him down with care, then raised her broken blade before her, facing the guards who advanced. The blade was bent and cracked from the duel, but in her hands it felt alive. Crowd leaned forward, holding its breath. No one moved, no one dared speak as the first guard lunged. His spear thrust toward her chest, but she caught the shaft and twisted it aside, driving her shoulder into his throat. He collapsed to the ground with a cry, and the crowd roared in chaos. More guards rushed her, their armor clattering like thunder, but she spun, striking with her blade, her body fueled not by law or code, but by something she had never known before. Daniel watched from where he leaned against the pillar, his vision blurred, his body trembling, yet his heart surged at the sight of her. This was not the warrior who had bowed her head in shame after losing to him. This was someone new, someone who had broken chains inside herself. He tried to move, tried to rise, but his body would not obey. Still he called out, his voice ragged yet clear. "Lyra, you are not alone. Stand with me." She heard his voice through the clash of metal and the roar of the crowd. It struck her like fire in her chest. With every blow she felt stronger, as though his words poured strength into her limbs. For the first time she was not fighting to prove her worth or to obey her clan. She was fighting for life, for the right to stand with another, for the right to choose her path. The guards faltered. One fell to her blade, another stumbled back with a cry, and the crowd erupted into shouts. Some cheered her name, some cursed her, but all were shaken. The elders slammed their hands upon the stone table, their voices rising in fury, demanding the guards crush her rebellion at once. But the people hesitated. Whispers spread through the seats. The humans' words still echoed in their minds, words that refused to die. Strength is not killing the one who falls. Strength is helping them rise again. Some of the younger warriors shouted in agreement. Others cried for the code to remain. The chamber trembled with division. Daniel forced his body upward, dragging himself to his feet with the last of his strength. His chains rattled as he stood beside her, blood running down his face, his chest heaving with every breath. He could barely hold himself upright, yet he stepped forward until he was at her side. The crowd gasped. The sight of the broken human standing beside their warrior shook them more than any blade. Lyra glanced at him, her eyes wide with both anger and awe. You cannot stand. You will die. He smiled faintly, though his lips were cracked. Then, I will die standing with you. Something inside her broke wide open at those words. She turned back to the guards and raised her blade high, her voice rising above the noise of the hall. You call me traitor, you call me weak, but I tell you this. Your code has chained us all. It has blinded us to what strength truly is. You fear change more than death. That is why you cling to law. But I will not bow to it anymore. The chamber shook with her cry. The people erupted again, their voices clashing like waves against stone. The guards hesitated, their eyes shifting to the elders for command. The elders rose in fury, their cloaks flaring, their voices sharp as knives. Cut them down. Show no mercy. The guards stepped forward again, but this time their feet were slower, their eyes unsure. Lyra tightened her grip on her blade. Daniel lifted his chains like a weapon, though his arms trembled. Together they faced the storm. The clash came swift. Spears struck, blades swung, but they fought side by side. Daniel blocked a strike with his chain, pulling the guard off balance, and Lyra drove her blade into his chest. She moved to cover him when another guard lunged, their rhythm weaving together as if they had trained as one. The crowd roared louder, divided between rage and awe, the sound shaking the very stones of the hall. For every guard that fell, more rushed forward, yet the hesitation spread. Some guards struck with half their strength, their eyes filled with doubt. Others faltered entirely, lowering their weapons as the human and the warrior fought together like a storm that refused to break. The elders screamed in fury, their power slipping through their grasp. They had ruled through fear, through the code. That crushed mercy, but before their eyes that code was unraveling. The people no longer moved as one. The guards no longer obeyed without question. The fire that had begun with a single human's defiance now spread like a blaze through dry grass. Lyra's blade clashed against another spear and snapped in half, leaving her with nothing but a jagged piece of steel. She held it tight all the same, her chest heaving, her body covered in wounds. Daniel stood beside her, his legs shaking, blood running from his side, yet his eyes still refused to close. They were surrounded, spears pointed at them from every side. The elders screaming for their deaths. The chamber held its breath. The crowd waited. The guards hesitated again. And in that silence Lyra raised her broken blade and Daniel lifted his chains. They stood back to back, two figures defying a world built on law and fear. Their bodies broken, but their will unshaken. In that moment, the hall saw not weakness, not failure, but something their people had forgotten long ago. They saw the strength of choice. The arena was frozen in that moment, when both sides had stopped breathing. Lyra stood with her broken blade, Daniel stood with his chains, and the circle of guards around them trembled between obedience and doubt. Above them the elders shouted with fury, their voices sharp and commanding, demanding death, demanding silence, demanding the code remain unbroken. Yet the sound of the people rose louder, 1,000 voices clashing like a storm. Some screamed for blood, others cried out for mercy, but hidden inside that chaos was something new, something that had not been heard in their halls for generations. People were beginning to question. Daniel swayed on his feet, his body close to giving way. But his eyes were steady as he looked across the sea of armored warriors. His voice, though weak, carried clear enough for all to hear. He spoke not as a prisoner, not as a man begging for his life, but as someone who had already accepted death and yet refused to bow. He said that strength was not measured by how many one could kill, but by how many one could lift. He said a people who destroyed the fallen would one day find themselves alone, with no one left to rise beside them. His words poured through the chamber like water breaking stone. The younger warriors shifted uneasily, their grips on their weapons loosening. Lyra felt her chest burn as she listened. She had once thought honor meant victory, that life itself was only worthy if no defeat touched it, but now she understood. That real strength was the choice to stand even when everything pressed against you. She looked at Daniel, broken yet unyielding, and felt that her people had been blind for too long. The eldest of the council rose, his cloak heavy with gold, his voice cutting through the noise. He called Daniel a liar, he called him weak, and he declared that their people would never bend to the words of a lesser race. He raised his hand and ordered the guards to strike, but the guards did not move. Their eyes were fixed on Lyra and Daniel. They had seen them survive the labyrinth together. They had seen them fight side by side, and though their law demanded obedience, something in their hearts wavered. For the first time in centuries, the order of the elders met resistance not from an enemy but from their own people. Lyra stepped forward, pulling Daniel with her, her voice strong enough to cut through the storm. She declared that she no longer accepted the code that demanded death for failure. She declared that strength was not silence but voice, not fear but choice. She told them she would rather die standing for this truth than live bound by chains of law that killed mercy. The crowd roared. Some shouted for her blood, but many more rose in shouts of defiance against the council. A chant began among the younger ones, calling for change, calling for freedom from the old law. The council tried to shout them down, but the voices only grew stronger, rolling like thunder until the very stone of the hall seemed to tremble. One guard lowered his spear, then another. Soon half the circle had stepped back, their eyes no longer hard with obedience but bright with uncertainty. The council screamed for their deaths, but the tide had turned. The people were no longer afraid. Daniel sank to his knees, his body finally giving way, but his hand found Lyra's arm and squeezed weakly. His lips moved, his voice faint but clear enough for her alone. Do not stop now, they are listening. Finish it. Lyra looked down at him, her chest heavy with emotion. She had been trained all her life to kill without hesitation, to obey without question, yet this human had broken that truth with nothing but his will. She turned back to the crowd and raised the broken blade high above her head. Her voice carried across the chamber. You call me traitor, you call me weak. But I tell you now that weakness is not in falling. Weakness is in refusing to rise. He has shown me this truth. He has shown me that we are blind. If you would kill me, then do it, but you cannot kill the truth. The truth will live in every one of you who has seen what real strength is. The crowd erupted in thunder. The chant grew louder, the sound shaking the pillars of the hall. The guards dropped their weapons to the ground. The council shouted in rage, their authority crumbling before their eyes. And then the first of the younger warriors climbed down into the arena to stand beside Lyra. Another followed, then another, until dozens stood with her, facing the elders with eyes that no longer feared. The power of the council shattered that day. The people rose as one, their voices drowning out the last cries of the elders. For the first time in living memory, the code was broken not by the hand of death, but by the will of the living. The elders were dragged from their seats, their rule ended by those they had once commanded, and in their place a new voice rose, a voice that said failure was not the end. A voice that said life was not only for the perfect, but for all who dared to stand again. When the storm settled, Lyra knelt beside Daniel, her hand holding his. He was weak, his eyes half closed, his body nearly destroyed by the trial. Yet when he looked at her, there was still that fire. She whispered to him that he had changed everything. She whispered that her people would never see strength the same. Way again. Daniel gave a faint smile, his voice rough as wind through stone. I only showed them what was always there. You were never doomed to die. You were waiting to see that living itself is victory. Lyra felt her throat tighten, something she had never allowed before. She pressed her forehead against his and let the truth settle deep inside her. He had given her not only her life but a new meaning for it. She would carry his way into the future. She would teach her people that strength was not the absence of failure but the refusal to give up. The crowd around them still chanted, their voices no longer demanding death but calling for a new path. The fire that had begun with a human prisoner now burned in every corner of the hall. The code that had ruled for centuries had fallen, and in its place something new had been born. Lyra stood again, lifting Daniel with the help of those who now gathered around them. The chains that bound him were cut away, and for the first time he stood free. He looked across the sea of faces once filled with hatred, now filled with something closer to respect. He had no crown, no throne, no armor, but he had given them what no ruler ever had, the courage to change. And as Lyra stood beside him, her broken blade still in hand, she knew her life would never again belong to the council or the old laws. Her life was now her own, and she would walk it not as the warrior who failed, but as the warrior who learned that the path their greatest strength was to rise together, the Enda.